at 6:33, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone again. I'm Krista Hoffman-Longton. I'm an assistant dean at the IU School of Medicine and an assistant professor of communication studies at IUPUI. I study science communication, and I have the incredible pleasure of serving as the moderator for Books, Booze, and Brains. And so we're happy to have all of you, and Jess has her four-legged friend with us tonight. Happy to see all of your four-legged friends. Welcome. We will go ahead and get started here in a few minutes. As many of you know, we usually start Books, Booze, and Brains with a little bit of housekeeping. I know that for many of you, this is a regular thing that you do every month, but for all of our new guests, welcome. We're so happy to have all of you. As I mentioned, I'm Krista Hoffman-Longton. I'm going to kind of walk you through what will happen for the evening and give you an opportunity to interact with our amazing expert guest, Dr. Bronson Edmunds. But before we get started, let me just give you a few housekeeping items. First, we want to thank our sponsors, Indiana Humanities, and thanks to our folks at Indiana Humanities for always making sure that we've got great marketing. We've got a website up and running. Indiana Sciences and March for Science. Rufus Cochran, as you know, is on the back end running our live stream on our Facebook page and on Twitter. The Indianapolis Public Library, who helps us to promote our events every month and make sure that you can check these books out of the library. And then Central Indiana Science Outreach, which is a great partner of Books, Booze, and Brains from the beginning. They're running Taste of Science events right now, so happy to have them here with us this evening. One of the things I wanted to mention before we get started is Indiana Sciences and March for Science every year runs the City Nature Challenge, which is coming up starting April 30th. And I'm going to go ahead and put the link for the City Nature Challenge in the chat here. It's given that we're still in a pandemic, right? It's not, you know, pandemic's not over just because you're over it. And so this event, the Nature Challenge, is a great opportunity for you to do some citizen science and get outdoors. There's an app that you download. You have an opportunity to take some pictures of things happening in the natural world and compete with your friends for badges. It's lots of fun, kind of a mix of social media stuff and some really cool out in nature stuff. So if you've not had a chance yet to check that out, I did go ahead and put that link in the chat regarding the City Nature Challenge. So lots of fun. And there are folks all over Indiana who are playing. So really happy to have you engaged in that. I think that's it in terms of events that we have coming up. I should ask, Megan, do you want to mention anything from Indiana Humanities? I know you guys have a big new program that has started that's kind of all over the city. Do you want to tell us what that is?
Yeah, I can do that. We actually have a second event tonight as part of our Bookmark Indie initiative. So if you haven't seen it, you can go to indianahumanities.org and click our main banner page. There's a new literary tour of Indianapolis. We've highlighted 19 sites of literary significance around the city. And you can go to those sites in person and see the little marker there and, you know, admire the space that inspired Indiana's writers. But there's also a really robust mobile app. So you can go to the website and look through all of these artistic responses to these locations throughout Indy. And then we'll be doing programming at the different sites all summer long. So I encourage you to go to indianahumanities.org, click on Bookmark Indy, and it's a great way to get out and explore the city again now that we're kind of emerging from pandemic.
Wonderful. Thanks, Megan. Yeah, so happy to have Indiana Humanities as a partner for this event. So for those of you that are new to Books, Booze, and Brains, we have just a few ground rules to keep our conversation going and to keep that conversation kind and supportive and inquisitive, right? That's one of our kind of signature hallmark ideas of these Books, Booze, and Brains events is that they give us an opportunity to ask questions of an expert and ask questions of one another. So first, make sure you're muted when you're not talking. That just helps us to manage ambient noise. I, like many of you, am working from home with a four-legged friend who sometimes gets a little rambunctious, so just try to keep yourself muted. Be yourself. I know sometimes that's hard in this virtual space. You're spending a lot of time looking at yourself. I spend a lot of time looking at myself, and I don't do that in the real world. So really try to kind of turn off that inner critic and engage with one another. And then, of course, be respectful. You know, you wouldn't want sometimes the things that come out of our fingers are not the things that would come out of our mouths. So try to keep that in mind. Ask questions using the chat feature on the tool. It's on the toolbar. You just click chat. You can open that up. And then that's a great way to ask questions while we're talking. You can also use the reactions feature, which is the little smiley face with the plus sign on your toolbar at the bottom. And they're like emojis. And that sometimes is helpful for us if we can't see your face, but you want to give us a thumbs up and let us know that you like what Dr. Chuck Edmonds or I'm saying. That's helpful. Let's see here. I'll ask Megan and Allison, if I miss something in the chat, which I'm bound to do when I get sort of chatting, to miss something in the chat. If I miss a really good question, please do stop me or make sure that I can see that at the end of the conversation so that we can have some time for Dr. Tucker Edmonds to answer those questions. And then if you do want to turn on your mic to ask a question, that's okay. Just use your raise your hand function, which is located in the reactions toolbar. And when you turn on your mic, just keep in mind that there's a half-second delay. So click on, turn your mic on, and then take a breath and then speak, and then we'll be able to hear your full question. So I think that gets us ready to go. I don't think I've missed anything. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our amazing guest, Dr. Bronson Tucker Edmonds, who is a wonderful friend and colleague of mine. I'm so happy to have you here tonight. Thank you again for doing this with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invite. I'm excited to
talk. Good. I hope you like the book. I thought it was really interesting. I have lots of questions about it. As you saw, I have lots of discussion questions for our group tonight. If you've not participated in the past, in a little while here, we'll move into some breakout rooms and you'll have a chance to do what we would do in a face-to-face space, which is sort of turn to your neighbor and have a conversation. And I assign those breakout rooms randomly. So you'll get a chance, hopefully, to interact with some folks that you may not know or might not be familiar with. So again, that call for being kind and respectful and supportive and inquisitive is one of the things that we ask for in those spaces. So Bronson, I'm wondering if you can, so I don't think I mentioned this, though I think everybody knows. Our book for tonight is by Angela Sayani. It's called Superior, and it's about the history of race science. And when we were talking about scheduling books for this year, I had heard an interview with Angela on NPR and just thought this book sounded really fascinating. And so I was really excited to bring it. And Bronson, I will share that you were one of the first people I thought about in terms of bringing this, because you and I have had so many conversations about this, particularly as it relates to educating medical students, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. But I'm wondering if you can begin, Bronson, by telling us who you are and what you do for a living and how your expertise and your work fits in with this book.
Sure. No, thank you. So my name Bronson Tucker Edmonds. I am an associate professor of obstetrics and gynecology at IU School of Medicine. And I have the privilege of working with Krista in a unit called Faculty Affairs, Professional Development, and Diversity. I'm one of the assistant deans for diversity at the School of Medicine. I'm also a health services researcher. And I do, what that means is that I study sort of the delivery and outcomes of healthcare sort of systems. And my particular interest is around kind of how doctors and patients communicate with one another, how they make decisions together. And I kind of look at that work through the lens of equity, through the lens of kind of how race and class and culture influence that dynamic and influence those outcomes on the other end of that doctor-patient interaction. So that's already sort of starting to dovetail into some of how my work and my interests really touches kind of at the heart of what tonight's discussion is going to center on. Other pieces of my work that are relevant and actually really newly, an area that I'm sort of noodling on a lot, have to do with workforce development needs, training needs for what we call the Indiana Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute. So I have a new role there where I serve as a co-director for workforce development. And that includes thinking about what are the training needs for investigators, for people who want to do research and advance knowledge, advance the health of populations. What are the needs for them to have in terms of training to understand this kind of this set of concerns? So it's actually squarely in the boat of some of the questions that I'm asking right now about how do we help our investigators bring an understanding about equity, and disparity to their work as they're designing studies, as they're doing responsible conduct of research, sort of the ethics components of how you do research, how you pick variables. Those are actually like, that's the nuts and bolts of how you end up with where we're going to end up talking about tonight. So actually, this was very, very timely. It's not a book that I had been, had been brought to my attention, but I almost feel like it should be like required reading for a lot of people that I'm engaged with right now. So thank you, Krista, for the opportunity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And like I said, when I read this book, I think part of what was interesting to me. So for those of you who maybe didn't dig in really deeply into Angela Saini as a person, though I will say, obviously, she talks a little bit about her own experiences in this book. One of the things I found that was really interesting is that she talked about the idea in the interview that I listened to, that this is a book for her that she has been wanting to write for a really long time, that she grew up in an area of London that I think was a pretty racially charged area, that she really felt like that her acknowledgement of being different than some of the folks that lived around her was a really early experience for her. And so she said that she kind of wanted, since she was a child, she had wanted to sort of write a book that kind of talked about this. So one of the things that I think might be helpful for us to kind of frame the conversation tonight is, Bronson, if you would talk a little bit about what, we understand race science from the book, though we always welcome folks who attend Books, Booze, and Brains, even if you've not read the book yet. This is sometimes a great introduction into the book. So can you talk a little bit about what race science is and whether or not maybe this book changed some perceptions for you? Because I will share that it did for me. And I think of somebody, like I think of myself as somebody who reads in this area quite a lot. That said, there were things that she brought up that I hadn't really thought about in terms of connecting these concepts. So what is race science, and how might this book have changed your perceptions?
Yeah, so I walked away sort of thinking about race science, and I think that term is sometimes used interchangeably with scientific racism, but I'll start with the cleaner notion around race science as sort of this effort to classify and distinguish human populations by virtue of, or kind of on the basis of race. Race for a long time was used synonymously with like species. So almost the notion of like classifying us as though there are distinct biological or genetic sort of innate differences between groups, and to assign that difference based on some notions around biology or inherent difference, as opposed to thinking about race as like a socially constructed set of variables that actually reflect more about how we've been socialized and how we interpret sort of phenotypic difference and ancestral and geographic origins, more so than those actually reflecting something that's innately different about us. So I think that I think about it really as that task or that effort to classify and distinguish difference by race as being kind of the core of race science. What I think this really added, well, first of all, the language of scientific racism, which wasn't necessarily a term that I was sort of using regularly, but really is at the crux of the matter and at the heart of the enterprise in some regards. If you look throughout history at the ways that science has been used to kind of promote, and I want to be clear about, I mean, it is a racist ideology, but when I'm saying that, I'm specifically speaking to the notion that there are inherently inferior and inherently superior groups as we understand them based on, like I said, these phenotypic differences or ancestral kind of origin kind of differences. So yeah, that piece of it was actually helpful to kind of really use that, appreciate that term and that framing. And the other things that I think really helped were to enlarge my vantage point. I studied as an undergraduate African-American history and community health, sort of my undergraduate studies at Brown. And so oftentimes, like, I feel like I have a fairly rigorous appreciation for like critical race theory in that context and thinking about the experience of Black folks in the US context in particular and that unique history. What I really liked about this book, and actually, I'm sure you guys have talked about cast at other times, or maybe you will, but was that it actually expanded it and put it in conversation with this global kind of phenomenon of how race has been constructed worldwide, sort of thinking more broadly about the impact of imperialism and colonialism, kind of, on a much broader scale, and then really looking at the threads that wove between anthropology, the threads that wrote, just across a whole host of different inputs. So for me, there was some really rich work that she did that helped to add to the foundation that I had in terms of my understanding of this topic.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I feel like that's one of the things that I left this book with was just like it was an incredible synthesis of information that I had been kind of touching on and reading in multiple places, right? So like you and many of you know that, both Bronson and I are on the IUPUI, physically situated here in Indianapolis. So we're having a lot of conversations locally on campus around equity and around thinking about the role that policy and structure of the institution might play into thinking about equity. And for me, because we were having all these conversations, it was like she did just a wonderful job of bringing together these conversations that seemed to be happening in disparate places and said, here's a cogent argument about why these things fit together and how it is that this idea of race and subsequently of classification and hierarchy exist within these structures. So I agree with you that for me was one of the most interesting parts of this book. Was I just felt like the arguments hung together in a way that I had not thought about. So I think that brings us to our first turn and talk question, and I think this is a good transition. So as a reminder, you'll in a few minutes receive an invitation to a breakout room. Again, those breakout rooms are assigned randomly. I didn't engineer them in any way. So Bronson, you'll stay here with me in the main room and we'll answer this question for folks that are joining us in the live stream. But for folks in the breakout rooms, I'm going to put the question for you in the chat. There you go. And then I'll also say it aloud, which is, we know that race is a social construct and not a scientific concept, even though there have been lots of folks over the years that have tried to apply the ideas of science to think about race. So the question, of course, is why do so many people still believe that the idea of race has some basis in biology? Why are these, and this is, you guys know that I ask this question a lot, which is a sub question, which is why is this so sticky? Why is this, misconception hanging on for so long? So what I'm going to do is go ahead and open the breakout rooms. I'll give you about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, to have a conversation in your breakouts. And then we'll come back to the main room and I'll ask a couple of folks to share some comments with the main groups. And Allison and Megan, when you get that invitation, you can go to the breakout rooms as well. And if anyone has any questions or you have any trouble, just bounce back to the main room. Bronson and I will be here and we're happy to help. So with that, opening breakout rooms now. And Bronson, again, you'll get an invitation. Just stay here with me.
So I push join? It says join.
So ignore it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like we'll give folks a couple of minutes to get into their breakout rooms, and then we'll kind of dig into this, Bronson, because I have some ideas about it, but it would be great to hear from you. And so it looks like just about everybody's found their way into a breakout room. And Mary and Rachel, I see that you're here. If you would like to join a breakout room, you've got that invitation. If not, you're welcome just to stay here in the main room with us. Thanks, Rachel. So Bronson, what do you think? Why do you think these ideas are so sticky? Why do they stick around for so long, even after we've had really good science to refute some of these ideas?
Yeah, so when I talk to people a lot about the fact that when science and like evidence and like the preponderance, like when facts are not moving the conversation forward, then you have to start to understand that you're talking about a belief system, not actually a scientific question. And I think that is for me, why I think this is so sticky. I think that there are absolute, and this came out even in listening, right, is that the preponderance of evidence that no one can replicate this, all the bodies, whatever, and that there's sort of an entrenched sense that like, we just haven't found out yet, right? And so, and so I think that that is really what operates, and that comes, I think it's really rooted in a desire to be, special, superior, or just good and moral. I think that to look back at the history of, real kind of like destruction and that has come, I think there is sort of a vested interest of wanting wanting the reality of how things are in the world to not necessarily fall to one's ancestors or to one's community, and to kind of be able to assign that to, destiny, biology, fate, et cetera, is an easier pill to swallow for some. So I think that's the most benign read on it. And then I think that there are the people who are actively wanting to push a, kind of white, you could call it white supremacist, but I would say I decided I might use the term white superiority agenda. And that's a belief system. It's not actually a scientific question that they're actually trying to promote. Sorry, that was a really long.
No, that's really great, right? Because the other thing about that I think is really interesting is the extent to which, we'll talk about the first, maybe like I'll call it the more charitable read, slightly more charitable read in a second. But the second read that, that folks are essentially, live in this belief system that particularly people who are white or who identify as white are, superior. The thing about that's so interesting to me, and the thing that I think this book does really well, is talks about the extent to which those groups couch these concepts in the trappings of science, right? That they make their arguments look like science, and how that shapes people's perceptions of, of the argument, right? Because when we are in school, we're taught, at the high school or middle school level, gosh, even at the elementary level, about the scientific method, and that there's a research question, and that we gather data. And so some of these studies look that way. And I think in doing that, it's an attempt to obviously legitimize a set of beliefs that are just, that are not well-founded. And so I think that that's one of the things that has been a problem for making these ideas so sticky, right? Or making these ideas so seductive, is that they appear to look like science. And that's like, what a great way to sell a lie. And so there's that piece, but I think that the other sort of the read that you have about sort of goodness and morality is interesting to me when we think about the, and I think Sani does a good job of talking about this, individuals in history who we think of as good people who have latched on to these false beliefs. And so, in OBGYN, we can talk about Margaret Sanger. I mean, we can talk about, there are Teddy Roosevelt, and we can talk about lots of people who I think are seen as good in some ways, but who have latched on to these ideas, sometimes with a, what's the right word, like misguided notion of being helpful. Right. I mean, even if you think about like the Nazi twin studies, for example, that were in part supposed to be designed to be, in theory, helpful to people, but helpful only to white people, and helpful, obviously, not to twins. So when we think about that sort of second piece, how do we rewrite that? What do we do with that history? How do we talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to first, I think a lot about like truth and reconciliation kind of thing, that these are kind of moments and opportunities to first unearth, and to kind of and to acknowledge the harm, because I think that it's that's just, this isn't the history that we've been taught. It's not the version of history we've been taught. It's actually, I was sort of smiling when you were mentioning some of the folks, Teddy Roosevelt, those kind of folks, where my daughter recently came and she was like, so wait, Abraham Lincoln didn't, like, he freed the slaves, but he wasn't really for like the slaves to be like equal. And I was like, yeah, she's like, so was he good or bad? And I was like, and I'm just, and there's also our tendency as a, you know, as a society and as, you know, to really want to push hard on this dichotomy.
Right, like, just like, let me just put people in groups, good or bad.
And I'm like, well, you know, I'm like, good people can do bad things, bad people can do good things. I was like, it's not that simple. But,
and meanwhile, your daughter's like, seriously, mom, I just want to know how to answer the questions on the test.
Right. It's always way too complicated when I start talking. So I do think, though, that just, you know, just telling a more complete version of the truth is an important starting point to kind of unpacking the ways that the narrative has been crafted with a specific agenda and endpoint to make, you know, whiteness both best and right and good, without complicating the narrative. And that's an important piece, is to complicate that narrative, because it is, because it is not that entirely.
Right. And I think about, go ahead, you were saying.
No, go ahead.
Well, and I think about, you know, you're talking about your daughter, right? And I think about doing that in the context of young people, where, you know, it is hard for young people to sort of see those gray spaces. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't challenge them to do that, right? I think that, you know, the initial reaction is always like, well, you know, you just, that they don't have the cognitive complexity to be able to do that, which I just don't believe is true. I think that you can give them a chance to kind of say, and it gives you this entry point into this conversation so that they can develop the cognitive complexity that we want them to develop through these conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, she's got examples every day of people that she like knows and loves who do things that aren't great. And, you know, so I'm like, you know, I think that she has some of the tools, not all of them. Like sure. The whole frontal lobe development thing, but I think that we can get there. And there are I think there's always developmentally appropriate ways to start these conversations about equity, about fairness, about kindness, about equality. You know, those are things that kids, I think, have the tools to begin to work with very early on.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring everybody back here and we'll have an opportunity to kind of chat with folks. I'll ask you to kind of restate some of the things that we've mentioned here as an entry point into getting folks to share their perspectives from their small groups. It's always exciting when we don't have folks come back from the small groups early, because it means that they're having really robust conversations. So I'm always happy about that.
I hope you guys don't think I'm drinking beer out of my mug. It is tea.
It's okay if you're drinking beer. That's part of the deal, right? That's the Books, Booze, and Brains thing. If you were drinking beer or wine out of your mug, it would be fine. I fully admit that I'm drinking beer, and I don't usually do that during public talk.
No, I know, but I feel like you should have a different container if I were going to drink beer. Like
like be fully open about,
yeah, like it should be like, aren't there like special glasses and things? I don't know about beer. I'm sorry. I feel like an imposter in that regard.
No, that's okay. That's okay. We do not discriminate. You know, whatever. If tea is your beverage of choice, we're all in. So it's good. It's good. So it looks like we have almost everybody back. We're going to take about 10 more seconds and get the folks back from the breakout rooms here and hear about the good conversations that you all had. And thanks everybody for being open and willing to meet some new people. I hope that you got a chance to chat about this first question, which is in the chat for you. And that question is, race is a social construct and not a scientific concept. So why is it that so many people still believe it has some basis in biology? And I mentioned to Bronson as we were leaving that I ask this kind of question a lot in Books, Booze, and Brains. So all of our recent attendees kind of get used to me asking a question that's essentially like, why is this history so sticky? Why is it that this concept keeps hanging on? And Bronson, you talked about sort of thinking about this in two ways, thinking about, you know, a group of people who maybe think one way and a group of people who think another way. Do you want to talk about that briefly before we dig into the small groups?
Sure. I mean, I kind of started off making the statement that I've concluded after thinking about this a lot, that when you have sort of the preponderance of like evidence and research, data, et cetera, pointing in one direction, in this case toward race as a social construct, and but people continuing to, like, if that's not moving the conversation forward or closer to, if facts aren't doing it, then I start to say, oh, this must be like a belief. And when I say a belief, I mean more like almost more of like I think about religious beliefs, right? Like this is like it's like a more of a doctrine of sorts than it is sort of a hypothesis, right? Because a hypothesis can be proven to not be true. It's the null hypothesis is always with you, and it's actually just repeated findings, are either going to prove it to be true or not true, whether you can replicate that. When you're getting this sort of body of evidence that's going in this direction, but people are like kind of hell-bent on going in this direction, then you have to start to wonder like what that is. And for me, it means that there's a group of folks that have sort of a vested interest and are kind of entrenched in moving forward this particular agenda. And we talked about sort of the why that might be. And I think that the more, I guess the more generous read, as Krista framed it, I think it is, that certainly good folks can kind of find themselves kind of swept up in the moment, and there's sort of a host of folks, I think, who are. It's easier to believe that this is about biology than that this is about a history of kind of destruction and subordination, and so there's sort of like this like moral like good person sense or like good ancestry kind of sense of things. And then I think, kind of the more nefarious kind of, folks are actually like actively pushing forward like a white superiority or white supremacist kind of agenda and couching it or kind of, shrouding it in the look of science, but really that's not what's at the heart of the matter. So, I kind of think about people on those poles, I guess.
It was helpful for me to hear you talk through that again, and to kind of think through that idea, right? That there are, I think that this is one of the things, Bronson, you and I have talked about this in terms of thinking about places where microaggressions occur in our work, right? That there are, I want to believe that there are, few individuals within the circle in which I work who sit down and say, oh, I would like to share with medical students racist ideology today, right? Like I have to hope that that's not what's happening, but instead it's, a person who maybe shares some of my values, but is not necessarily attending to all of them in the way that I might be attending to them. And so, or maybe not for that matter. I mean, that's the sort of point of unconscious bias for that matter. So I think it's interesting though, to think about kind of both of these concepts, right? The idea that there is this, as you said, kind of more nefarious, sense of superiority that is a set of ideas. And that's one of the reasons why these concepts are sticky. But there's also this piece of it's hard to accept these complicated ideas of particularly individuals in history that we might want to paint as good people. And I think that can be one of the challenges. That's one of the things I think that Sayana does a good job of talking about. So I'd like to turn it to the whole group, and to do that, I'm going to unpin us and give you all an opportunity to share your ideas and perspectives. So I can see you Brady Bunch style here, and you all should be able to switch to Brady Bunch style if you would like, in the top right corner, and just sort of share your ideas about how your groups went. I see that Dale has his hand raised, so we'll go with Dale first, and then Rose will take you second. So Dale, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and share your comments.
Okay, this is Dale. I'm Pat.
Hi Pat. Hi Dale. Good to meet you.
Anyway, I can't, when you think about the whole definition of race from the 1600s, that quality of science that's driven a lot of the science for the last 400 years is about the same quality of science as when the Greeks pre, 5000 BC had earth, wind, water, fire as their 4 elements, right? Now we've built a body of science based on a false foundation for 400 years, right? So it's going to take time, one, for the science community to catch up, because good science takes time. We don't like that fact. Good science takes time. So they're getting the science right.
That's a
Getting the
great
fact
point.
that marketing to these segments, artificially defined segments, right, brings value to people. And I think that the more nefarious people, yeah, there's 1 or 2 or maybe 5% of real idiots out there that will never buy in, right? But for the most people, like I come back to a quotation of never attribute to malice that which is adequately defined by stupidity, right? The other thing is coming from a fairly intellectually aggressive work environment. And I had a manager one time said, understand the difference between trading paint because you're fighting for your ideas and trying to get the best idea out there and right, versus truly crashing somebody up, right? And I think we need to understand that, we're all gonna have a bad day. We're all gonna say something stupid and, be microaggressive to somebody. But again, if you take that from the viewpoint of never attribute to malice that which is adequately defined by stupidity, cut the person a break, and yeah, some people because of our culture have to cut more breaks than others. And we need to apologize for that.
No, yeah, I think that you make a really good point that one of the things that is important in this process as we are thinking about these concepts is that notion of how we define learning and why that's an important conversation to have as a group of people who care about these issues, right? And the way that I always, and my students, one of the conversations I always have with my students is this: at the beginning of the semester, we talk about, okay, how do you define, how does science define learning? And then how do you for yourself define learning? And I, as a teacher, and as a teacher in both these informal contexts and more formal contexts in my classroom, define learning as growth. And in a very broad sense. And I think that the reason why I do that, especially for my colleagues who teach in informal environments like museums, for example, the way that we think about growth, to me, offers a lot of space to keep learning and space to define your own benchmarks, which I think is a really important part of, Pat, to your point about giving somebody a little bit of space to move beyond some of those microaggressions that they may, or unconscious biases, even kind of beyond that they may not know are happening. And I think that that's an important part of this process as we're talking about understanding why are these ideas so sticky? Why are we in a place where we're not questioning these things? So Rose, I want to give you a chance to share your ideas and perspectives. Thank you so much, Pat, for being able to put those ideas out there. Go ahead, Rose.
So I was in the same group as Pat, and so you're going to get a little dominated by this. But so on the surface, skin color, eye color, hair color is biologically related, but that doesn't mean that all those other genes have anything to do with who you are underneath. And that, since this has been going on for so long, that people need a way to make themselves feel better. Although someone did also mention that it's human nature to want to categorize things, especially for us OCD people that like to put things in boxes. But the problem comes when it's, I'm better than you are. And, the other thing is, and this kind of just struck me that it's almost easier to know the white supremacists and all that, where they stand. But it's when people have the misunderstood implicit bias, that's really hard. And I have to admit, I catch myself in that also.
Well, and I think the thing that is so important, and Bronson, I would be interested in your perspective about this, but I know we've talked about this as a team as well. Rose, you use the language, I have to admit, as if it's somehow a fault of yours that you have unconscious bias. And I think that that's one of the places that, for me, a book like this kind of helps us to sort of normalize. All of us have, that's the definition of unconscious bias, right? We all have it. And so rather than saying, that this is something that I should be ashamed of, instead saying, this is something I'm always working on. And I will be always working on it in the same way that I am always working on making my golf swing better, though I am still a terrible golfer, right? Like that is an important part of this, that I think that there are things that we're comfortable saying we're always growing in. But I think that given our particularly social environment right now, it's hard to say out loud, I don't know everything about this. And so I'm so sorry that I used the incorrect pronoun, or I'm so sorry that I said something that was offensive. I truly didn't understand. Help me learn more. That those kinds of conversations, I think, are the most important conversations to get us past. And one of the things I think that's important is that gets that one relationship past, that issue, but it doesn't get the whole system past that issue. And I think that that's the other important thing that we need to keep talking about. Bronson, do you have any other comments or anything else that you want to share before we move into our next question?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts, but I don't want to take up all the time on just one question, because you put together so many good questions. So I think that I'm gonna actually, I appreciate who put the link here. I'm gonna read a little bit more about Hanlon's razor. My mind went in two directions, because on the one hand, I actually really like that as kind of a frame, especially about extending grace, which I think, to the points that you were just making, Krista, is really going to be necessary and helpful for us to be able to kind of engage in these kinds of conversations in productive ways, and to be able to move everyone from wherever they're starting to kind of a different and hopefully better place. And then I was also trying to figure out, in what context, do we have, what are the stakes, and whether context matters for whether or not that can be applied. My mind went to kind of the thinking about malice versus stupidity, and realizing that whether it's malice or stupidity, it can be harmful and it can potentially kill. I was thinking about some of the recent police thing with the taser. I'm I don't know if that was malice or stupidity. I don't know, but that person is dead, and there's nothing to be said for whether that was their intention or whether that was an error. And of course, we all make errors. And so I was thinking a little bit about the context in terms of how high are the stakes. And this scientific enterprise, it took me to say, are the stakes high in this space? And actually, as we look at how it's been deployed, Nazi Germany, that there are these moments when it's become extraordinarily high stakes, and that whether it was malice or stupidity, and sometimes we can only know what to call it in hindsight, right? That it actually did severe damage. And so I'm trying to wrestle with that about how do we frame it in terms of context, and hold that intention with what I actually really believe is an important sort of truism to carry with one another in our interpersonal dealings. You know what I mean? But when we talk about how things are structured and recognizing how structures can cause harm, that's where I'm trying to kind of piece that. So thank you for getting those wheels turning in my own head, and I can sit with that conversation some more, Dale. I appreciate you bringing this Hanlon's razor principle to my knowledge.
Yeah, I think that you make a good point, Bronson, that one of the challenges that we will always face in this context is that there's this question of intention, which is not, from a social scientific standpoint, highly measurable. It's very hard to measure intention. It's very hard to be able to talk about intention post hoc after something happens, to be able to talk about the idea of intention and how that fits into the concept, particularly if you are talking about harm, because generally speaking, though not exclusively, but generally speaking, we as humans operate on the basis that we don't want to inflict harm, though again, I know that that's not always true. So I think that shapes the way that we think about intention and how we talk about intention afterward. And I think that these concepts in particularly if we're talking about the long arc of history, right? I think about even this is a very tiny concept, but the idea that a number of years ago, I did an interview about some work that I was doing in science communication. And I was talking about scientists communicating their work to the general public. And what I said was that generally speaking, that science, one of the things that's important for scientists to remember is that broad audiences, non-scientific audiences, aren't dumb. They just want the opportunity to engage in a conversation where they know the vocabulary. And in hindsight, that word dumb really came off poorly, right? Like it made me feel as if I was saying that somehow scientists believed that these audiences were dumb, which I don't think is true. But I think when we're thinking about this concept of intention, it's important to remember that we all have connotations and denotations, and we're bound by the language that we have to talk about these things, right? Language is a symbolic structure that we use, and all of that gets wrapped up into the way we think about intent, right? Because we think in symbols. So I think for me, this actually gets us really nicely into our next turn and talk question. I'm looking at the time, and I do want to make sure we get to all of our things. So I'm going to give another turn and talk question and give everybody a chance to chat. And I think this will dovetail well. And then Bronson, you and I can talk about it in the main room. We'll come back. Okay. So our next turn and talk question is, does the ability of race science resurfacing stem from a lack of understanding of history? So here it is in the chat. Does the ability of race science to resurface stem from a lack of understanding history? If not, why has it resurfaced? So I realize now, I was writing these questions late last night, that this is not a very coherent question. So y'all can take me to task on this later. Let me see if I can rephrase it in a way that's slightly more comfortable. How about saying something like, we know that race science has sort of resurfaced in recent years. Why has it resurfaced? Is it about a lack of understanding of the history? So why has race science resurfaced? Is it a lack of understanding of the history? If not, what else might it be? Take that where you will. So with that, I'm going to give you an opportunity to go to your breakout rooms and sort of talk about why is it that you think race science has resurfaced, and if it is potentially about a lack of understanding of history. I think that obviously, I think the answer is no, it's not just a lack of understanding. I think there are other things at play. But that's for you all to talk about. All right, so I'm going to send you to your breakout rooms again. And for the folks that have joined recently since our last breakout space, give me just a second and I'll get you to a breakout room here in a minute. But if you've got that invitation, go ahead and join your breakout room. And again, Bronson, just ignore that and stay here in the main room with me. All right, I've gotten so good at managing Zoom breakout rooms. I'm so proud of myself that I can make this work.
You're like the master there. That's nice.
And of course the university is moving to Microsoft Teams, where I don't know how to use breakout rooms at all. So I'm gonna have to figure it out all over again. I feel like just when I got good at it, it goes away. Okay, so why do we think that this concept of race science has resurfaced? Is it about a lack of understanding? Obviously, I don't think it's about a lack of understanding, right? This is my decision science brain, putting that brain on to say more information is not going to change people's behavior, right? People don't need more information, right? I don't need more information about why I should exercise. I know why I should exercise, but I can talk myself out of it any day. So what do you think? What are some of the cultural, political factors right now that have made this resurgence happen?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think our political climate, I guess there's a part of me, and I think you wrote in one of your questions, it doesn't really ever go away. It never really went away. I feel like it sort of lays dormant based on how acceptable it is to be forthright in one's assertion white superiority, right? And because of where we find ourselves, not just in the US, but globally, with sort of the pendulum swinging back toward nationalism, and white, like superiority, white supremacy, et cetera. Like, I think it's just that the climate has been ripe, the political kind of and social climate has been ripe for these ideas to come forward more kind of on its face, presenting themselves for what they are, as opposed to sort of the repackaging effort that has had to happen. It's a very kind of a depth, and I actually really appreciated her detailing how, they have sort of, with what I would say are nefarious funding sources with a particular, agenda, have been able to kind of keep these ideas afloat and circulating in a community, sometimes beknownst to people, sometimes unbeknownst to people. And then I think it's just that question of how much volume, prominence, and opportunity they have to be able to be out front and forthright with their agenda. And so I think we're in a moment right now where people are certainly emboldened to bring those ideas forward in ways that they maybe would have been shunned in some of the decades between World War II and, maybe the 80s or 90s when things started to resurface.
Yeah, because I think I was thinking about what makes the political and social climate ripe for these things, like sort of naming, one of the things I think it would be interesting to kind of hear your perspective that I think makes the political and social climate ripe for these things to happen is fear. Mm-hmm. Right? That the idea of fear, so even if you take discrimination against the LGBT community and the AIDS crisis, mm-hmm. right? That there's this place of fear that people are operating from. So it seems okay for us to proliferate these ideas that are about sort of an us, them kind of mentality because we feel more fear.
Yeah. Oh, no, I think that's great. That's really key.
So thinking about what are the feelings that people have that lead to making this okay or not okay? And so fear to me is the first one that came to mind. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, from my standpoint, you can't read the rise, of our last administration without sort of looking to what it meant to have a Black president. And I think that in terms of what that means about race, the whole post-racial debate, really, if you look at, and there were things that had to converge in terms of the police shootings and other kinds of things that happened. But if you really look at the ramp up to, kind of where we landed, by 2015, 2016.
Yeah.
That yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say and again, shout out to journalists who I think are able, one of the things I think about journalist training that is unique is their ability to sort of pull together both kind of the short arc of history with the long arc of history, yes. Right? So I think about Ta-Nehisi Coates' article when my president was Black, right? Probably one of my favorite pieces of journalism of all time. I would love to, assign it to every class that I have, because I think that it does sort of speak to how we as humans re-story experiences, and why restoring experiences is an important part of understanding history. And I think you're right to say that, that in order, when we can't have this conversation without the context of the previous administration and the Obama administration, to be able to sort of look at that slightly longer arc, though not very long, in the context of history.
Yeah, no, and again, I think you could probably go back before it, but I was just thinking specifically to your point about fear and how some of this, the current moment. I think that's a big piece of it, and and with that came our stance on immigration, there's a whole host of things.
Right, the Occupy Wall Street. When we think about it from an economic perspective, right, that there are all of these other things that are happening that that I think are social forces that allow for this to bubble up again. To kind of yeah, I don't have a good metaphor to describe it. But I think to bring these ideas to the
I just
forefront.
call it an outbreak. I wrote down herpes here. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, I think that's actually probably the most accurate of it's what's nice about bringing OBGYN in these conversations, right? You're like, let's really put that metaphor out there.
Kind of lay dormant in the, the neuron, and then just, but anyway.
I'm supportive of that metaphor. Yeah, that's fine. I think that this is the first for books, booze, and brains. And this is like, again, like one of those moments that I realized that I'm out of, like, I used to be a safer sex educator when I was in undergrad, and clearly I've been out of that space. And because you said that, and I had to blush. Like, so I was like I used to not blush anymore when we talked about those things. It's very funny.
Yeah,
makes me realize how practiced I am.
I'm the last OBGYN getting invited.
No, of course not. Of course not. That's not true. Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that this climate of fear, also this, again, as you said, sort of these spaces for these other conversations to happen that are around economic forces, political forces, and social forces that shape the way that folks do or don't feel comfortable. I also think that, I always hate to, as like the sort of media scholarly person, I always hate to blame things on this, but I do think it is about the proliferation of information, the sort of democratization of information, right? The idea that, like, if I wanted to find a journal article, even 25 years ago, it was much harder to find a journal article than it is now. And, that the public knows what scientific journals are, that they, beyond JAMA, right, which everybody knew, but, that and so what that means, again, kind of going back to the, couching this science in the trappings, this fake science in the trappings of science, you can see how people who are maybe in between these spaces, in between the spaces of, you were talking about, like, being good and moral versus the sort of science, the superiority complex, that people get sucked in to some of these false ideologies because it looks like real science. And I think that's one of the hardest things for my field into the future, is thinking about how do we train students to evaluate information? How are we training, and particularly given the fact that my field and Joseph's field, like as professors, that there is this sort of anti-intellectual, anti-higher education movement that's happening in this country. So it's going to have to be in the K-12 space that we're teaching people to evaluate this information. And we don't have good tools to do that right now.
Yeah, we really don't. And it's I think it's challenging. I mean, it's challenging because it's in, like, I can't remember, Mankind or whatever the, like, throwaway article journal was that she was mentioning, but then it's also, in Science and in Nature. And it's also in, like, legitimate spaces with legitimized scientists. And I think that that was something I was really wrestling with kind of midway through. It's just like, what does it mean to, on the one hand, be trying to promote this notion of, like, trust science in this moment of, like, vaccinations? In fact, it is horribly flawed and very much politically and socially influenced and biased as an enterprise. And what do we do with that dual reality? How do we cultivate trust in the enterprise when it has not always shown to be? And that's a question that, we're wrestling with in general in terms of, like, research ethics and things like that. But I actually, this arc, this narrative that, that we were reading, what really kind of pushed me on that question.
Yeah, I just wrote down, what does it mean to, quote, trust science during a time when we need to be critical of the enterprise overall? And I think, like, gosh, that's like careers worth of research questions. And yeah, absolutely. I'm going to give these folks a 2-minute warning here and bring them on back. Really good questions. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to bring everybody back. And Bronson, I'll probably ask you to sort of talk a little bit about the idea that, the climate never really went away, that it just sort of lay dormant, and talk a little bit about your perceptions of the political and social issues. And then maybe we'll dig into that last question that we ended on about trust in science. So that's where we'll try to take this as part of the conversation.
Okay.
All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had good conversations. We're just going to wait a few minutes here for everyone, well, a few minutes, more like 30 seconds, for everybody to come on back. And I hope we'll have another really good conversation about this. Bronson and I could probably talk about this stuff for ages. Let's see here. It looks like we've got just about 25 seconds left. I said to Bronson earlier, it usually means folks are having good conversations in their breakout rooms, so I always hate to cut them off. But I appreciate your willingness to chat with me here and to come back to the main room. It's really good to see so many folks from previous months. I hope that you all are doing okay during the pandemic. I miss seeing you in person. All right, so we had a great conversation here in the main room. Would love to hear how some of the small groups sort of tackled this poorly worded question. Again, my apologies. But essentially what we want to know here is, does the ability of race science to resurface stem from a lack of understanding of history? And if not, then why has it resurfaced? So in other words, what is it that's in the political, social, scientific climate that allows this, what is really a collection of falsehoods, to sort of resurface on and off over time? Bronson and I have some ideas here that we've talked about in the main room, but I'd love to hear from your groups first about how and where your conversation went. So again, you're welcome. If you'd like to just share some ideas from your small group, you can click the raise your hand button, which is located under the reactions tool. And if you can't find that, or if you're on a phone, just go ahead and turn your mic on. We're relatively small this evening and should be able to acknowledge it quickly. So how did you answer this as a small group?
I guess I can.
Go ahead, Michael.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead, Michael. We'll have you start.
okay. Our group. I think the short answer about history is, yeah, I think there's a lack of understanding of history, but as you said, I don't think it's the primary cause of the problem. I mean, I think in general, we don't understand history very well. I think that the cause for the rise in racial tension and that's going on right now is a classic one of that a group of people are fearful of losing their abilities or their position. The rise of white supremacy here is, and a number of studies have shown that they're afraid of becoming a minority. And I think it's a classic tool to try to blame the problems that are going on in the society on other groups. I mean, Hitler used it very effectively, and it's being used, attempted to be used here as well. And so it's kind of goes back to just a fear, or you're losing your position in society and in the future, and you're going to start reacting to that. I think that's, to me and to us, we were in our discussion, this is a big part of it.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Bronson and I talked about that as well, that there are, certainly some things that are around the social and political climate that may have made these ideas more acceptable, maybe is another way to say that. And I think that you've kind of drawn on some, again, both political and social forces that I think shape these conversations. I see that Pat and Dale have their hand raised again. I want to make sure, not because we don't want to hear from you, Pat and Dale, but I want to make sure that we still hear from some other groups as well. So I'll just give a chance before we call on you to see if we have others that want to sort of speak to this issue. And if not, then Pat and Dale, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, I kind of started out the time with saying, race science as it's defined today is an oxymoron. It's not science, right? It's, you know,
Debate that.
you know, it just,
I guess our group seemed to think that it's always been going on, and it just has been brought up again, but it's always been there and under the cover.
Under the surface, yeah.
Under the surface, or is it a slow news month? If there was a
Right.
big national disaster that filled every moment of our thought, i.e. Nazi Germany, we wouldn't even, well, which was race, but I mean, oh, I don't know, 9/11, well, maybe another race. Oh, I don't know, moon or aliens coming down and stuff. We wouldn't be thinking about any of this other stuff. We'd just be reacting to our everyday life and how it affects
That's a really
us.
good point, and I will share as we are. So Bronson, I might flip around our sort of conversation, and Dale, this might speak to that a little bit, and that's the idea that we are to some extent governed by the news cycle, and we are governed by the ubiquity of information in a way that did not exist even 30 years ago. You know, I said to Bronson, like, you know, when I was in college, I had to put my socks and shoes on to go get a journal article. Whereas now, you know, anybody can read a PubMed article. And I think that those differences have meant that we think about the democratization of information in different ways. We think about the concept of science in different ways. I mean, we even have a term called citizen science, right? I started this talking about the idea that an everyday person can be part of the scientific enterprise. And the scientific enterprise is something we know that on one hand, we want people to trust, see COVID vaccines, whatever. And on the other hand, we believe it is a system that should be worthy of critique, given some of the ways in which the system was built on some, I would argue, colonialist ideology. And so I think as we're thinking about these concepts, there are these sort of political and social arcs that happen over time. And there are things that are unique to this time in history that are probably worth interrogating. So Bronson, you wanted to make some comments about that. So I'm going to give you the floor for just a couple of minutes.
Oh, I think you summed it up beautifully.
So one of the things, Bronson, that you sort of talked about that I think is important is the idea that that sometimes the political climate and the social climate allow some of these ideas to be more acceptable than other ideas, and how that has sort of shaped the conversation over time. Do you want to talk more about that, and about kind of, you talked about sort of the even presidential administrations and how that shaped those ideas?
Sure. I mean, I was thinking, I was talking in terms of I was saying, it's very much like you guys were saying, Dale and Pat, about the notion that it was, and I think Michael also said that these are really not ideas that ever go away, right? They lie dormant. There are particular kind of, seemingly kind of, I would say nefarious kind of engines and, fueling, kind of giving resources and finances to support it to be able to sort of stay alive, even while it's not being widely accepted. I think she does a nice job of really painting that picture for us. But just to sort of stay kind of under the radar while it's not fashionable, or kind of while it's frowned upon. But then as these like pendulums swing, and I think a lot of what swung that pendulum did have to do with fear. And I was just sort of putting it into the context of our more recent administrations that, you can't, I think in the US context, you can't underestimate the impact that it had for, to have a Black president in our nation with regards to this like fear and sort of loss of power, loss of dominance, minoritized kind of frenzy of fear that I think it then spurred in subsets and segments of the population, and then also in spaces that were really like powerful and well-funded segments of the population, which then I think helps to move this into a more prominent space of acceptability, right? That these are not, they don't have to be sugar-coated or reinvented or repackaged, which we also saw her kind of show us examples of that kind of went underground or maybe presented themselves with different terminology or whatever, but now they can actually be pretty forthright in their assertions in the climate that we find ourselves in this moment because of where that pendulum has swung and what we've sort of said is acceptable and fair game, both in the scientific community and in society at large. And I think, yeah, you did, we weren't saying that to be the only factor. We were just talking about the convergence of like where we are with technology, where we are with, you know, the financial markets, where we are, like all of these things kind of converging to this moment where not just in the US, but globally, we're seeing this, this kind of backlash of sorts and kind of fear factor. So yeah, it's really a ripe environment for, I won't use the word that I talked about an outbreak in the main room when we weren't here with you guys all together.
I think that we can say that Bronson wanted to use the herpes metaphor as a way to describe. This is one of the advantages of bringing OBGYN to talk about race science, right?
Then I said varicella zoster might be a little bit
right. Yes.
You know, it can lay dormant for decades. And
right, there you go. Exactly. So Bronson, this actually does kind of transition us, not this really silly metaphor, but this does kind of transition us into a question that I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about how you think about the concepts of unconscious bias as it relates to scientific research and healthcare research. And you know that this is, for me, one of the things that is an important part of my research, right, is thinking about the role of, I use the CTSI loves the term regular Indiana people, right? That is individuals that are not part of the scientific enterprise, helping us to create research questions, helping us to sort of see science as is owned in part by the individuals who participate in studies. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how unconscious bias in the past maybe has snuck into the research process and kind of how your work seeks to address those issues.
So I think, I mean, the unconscious bias piece is really, it's really pervasive. Even as we think about something very simple, like how race is used as a variable. And actually, she did a really nice job of talking about this in terms of like all the things that we control for, but that oftentimes we're kind of trying to like back into something, or we're looking for some, she talks about the ways that the NIH, has for a long time now, really with representation in mind, had folks collecting data on race and ethnicity, and actually also sometimes requiring, representation in order to ensure that there was, that all populations were being engaged, because on some level, the downside, right, if you don't, is that, okay, now we don't know what this means for people coming from different lived experiences and things like that. Whether we believe that to be biological is sort of a separate is sort of the next step that people default to because, of course we need all these different groups because we need to know how it works in Black people. And I think that that's where, like, that's just right under the surface. And it's so prevalent, it's so pervasive. And Krista spoke earlier to the fact that medical education, right? We talked about these were physicians oftentimes who were, promoting and purporting these notions about race and classification, about different brain sizes, different lung function, different kidney function, different, different intelligence, those are things that have been, race as a risk factor has stood as a proxy for biology, for genetic difference, for inherent difference for a very long time in not just science, but in medicine. And so rethinking how we understand the use of that variable. What is it actually a proxy for? Is it a proxy for culture? Is it a proxy for for disadvantage and oppression? Is it a proxy for the lived experience of racism or exclusion? Like rethinking that on that very basic level of how are we understanding how this variable operates when we just plop it into a model and start looking for difference, because it makes a huge difference for how you interpret that finding. When you've got an effect size now or an odds ratio where there's an increase, to understand race as risk, are we talking about that as being something inherent or internal to that, so, you know, the folks in that group, or external to them in terms of how we think about intervention? So I actually think it's really that these really deeply held assumptions, and I would say to someone's comment earlier about, you know, having to admit, you know, it's like everybody's been being fed the same, you know, the same thing, you know. I mean, when she talked about the salt retention piece and like hypertension hypothesis, you know, Oprah, you know, I mean, certainly I heard it, you know, in lots of Black spaces, you know, like it's not like everybody is consuming this, and we all carry these messages around superiority, inferiority, and are bringing that lens to interpret, to make our design decisions and to interpret our data. So it really, and to ask the question to begin with. So it really requires us to interrogate those assumptions on the front end, and like early and often as we think about research design and you know, developing and implementing studies. Am I getting at what you're talking about, Krista?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think
go off.
No, I think it's really good. And I think it does illustrate just how, as you said, pervasive these ideas are. I mean, I'll share with all of you, Bronson and I are working on an elective where we're working with medical students to look at some places where unconscious bias shows up in the medical cases that we use to teach the students themselves. One of the things she was talking about, the idea that we tend to use proxies to mean other things, right? So whether it's race or gender as a proxy to mean something else. One of our most interesting examples, I think, that we found in a study we've done recently is a moment where a case study was describing, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Smith are parents of a child. That child has a genetic abnormality, and we gave those in the fictional case that we wrote. We said, you know, Mr. Smith has a high school education and works as a carpenter, and Mrs. Smith is a homemaker. And then we asked some questions, and really by giving those individuals occupations and level of education, what we were asking students to do, I think, I didn't write the case, I think, is to try to determine their level of health literacy, right? How aware might these parents be about how genetics work? But you all know that just because someone has a high school education doesn't mean that they remember how genetics work. And the other way around, someone could, you know, be very well educated and not know how genetics work. And the flip side of that, right? You could have very little formal education, but done a lot of reading about how genetics work. And so we tend to fill in the gaps for students in an effort to be, I don't know, in an effort to create realism potentially in these cases. And I think that in doing that, we sometimes introduce unconscious bias. And I think that that's to me, it's a very salient example of the ways in which these biases about all, you know, in this case about race, but in other ways get perpetuated into, in our case, future care providers, right? And I have to be honest, I don't see that as egregious. Like nobody is being overtly racist in that scenario, but that's still something that we need to fix when we think about what is the expertise of patients? How are we allowing the space to ask questions that we haven't thought about asking?
Yeah, and I know we're running low on time, but it's such an important point, Krista, that part of why we got into that space is that so much of medical education is really structured around pattern recognition when you're early on, when you're trying to understand how to identify disease processes. And so it's very prone to stereotyping, and it's very prone to like you see Black patient pain, got to be sickle cell. You see, Latino, you should be screening for IPV. And it's like very prone to very negative, I'm sorry, IPV is intimate partner violence, right? Because of these notions about machismo. I mean, very strongly stereotyped and oftentimes inappropriately so, in terms of the dots that we are trying to like force people to connect, and also baking into people's assumptions about these like 2D depictions of what risk factors come with aspects of identity. And also it creates the possibility of creating errors in the opposite direction, right? Because sometimes, the gay man, isn't coming in with a rash so that you can know it's right. These totally tropes, it's got to be HIV related. They might just have a toothache. You know what I mean? And so when you're seeing somebody in real life, they don't know that they're supposed to fit into these sort of two-dimensional, pieces. And it's really, so we've been talking, it's not just us, but like, it's an active conversation across the country about like our students deserve better. Our students are also demanding better because they're recognizing sort of the damage and harm that's actually done. And again, there's a whole history of how we got here in terms of, we're just trying to create, we just want them to recognize the patterns. They have to start somewhere. We don't want to put in distracting information. There's a whole lot that goes into it. And it's hard. It's actually hard work to try to think differently about how we do that work. So yeah, it's an important point to raise. I know we're coming to the end of time, but thanks, Krista, for reminding me of that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've got a couple of questions that have come to me in the chat that I'll kind of put out there, Bronson, and give you a chance to answer those. And now would be a really good time. We've got about 7 minutes left. So if you have questions for Dr. Tucker Edmonds, please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you'd like, raise your hand, and we'll have you turn on your mic and camera if you'd like here in a minute to ask those questions. So one of our participants asked about funds seeking and the extent to which faculty members seeking out particular funds have impacted the type of research that they're doing. So thinking about kind of who is behind the sources of income, what is the impact of special interest groups in scientists looking for grants, particularly related to a particular kind of research. So Bronson, do you want to talk about the funding climate and how the funding climate maybe changes with the ebb and flow? I mean, I'm thinking about the grant that you're applying for right now and thinking about workforce development and how to some extent that opportunity kind of came, I think, in part because of the social and political climate, though not entirely. So you want to talk about that?
Sure. I'm trying to figure out how to do it succinctly. I mean, funding is a challenge, and it's kind of what careers are built and die based, in tenure tracks in particular. If you can't get funded, you usually can't get promoted and can't keep your job. So it's a big point of pressure in the scientific arena. And I think that we've watched over the last several decades, the amount of funding and investment in doing, science shrink dramatically, where a lot of the people who are at the end of their careers started, let's just say they call them pay lines. Like, let's just say 30% of applications were getting funded. Now the pay lines are in like the 10% of applications are getting funded through like the NIH in terms of that being one of the primary sources. And it also matters what the NIH is prioritizing, right? So they have these moments where all the attention and actually billions and billions of dollars, like for a very long time, have been focused on genetics. And if we could just find the gene that turns on the switch, or if we could just find, and then a lot of, actually, they just did some work looking at disparities in investigators. There's a black-white gap in terms of Black investigators not getting the highest level kind of funding award. And they've looked at, oftentimes they're studying topics that are community engaged work, that are population health related, that are disparities or equity related. And that hasn't been the priority. Those things are not being funded at the same levels. And so that work is not getting funded. Those investigators are not getting funded. Those careers are not advancing. So there's huge implications for where the priorities, who's setting the priorities, what questions are getting funded? What questions are they asking us to ask? Because that's where people then move their agendas, is to answer the questions that they're asking us to ask and fund. So it is, I don't want it to sound totally coerced. There's a degree of academic freedom that exists, but your decisions are impacted by the viability of an idea and whether there's an audience for it and whether there's a funding source for it. And that does then make it a vulnerable enterprise when you have other sources like she talks about, these kind of foundations and things where they have agendas, but you can keep going back to that source if you line up with their agenda. And those foundations tend to not have the same maybe level of rigor oftentimes. That's not true for all foundations. There's lots of very rigorous foundations, but depending, there's a range, so much variability. So I don't know how to answer it shortly. I didn't do a good job at all, but yes, it's the short answer. Funding, climate matters, funding sources matter. And as she, I think, does a really nice job of depicting, of writing about, they can really float particular agendas because they, don't fall under maybe some of the same regulation when you got private foundations and things.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that it does to your point, again, I remind folks that there were absolutely great folks doing coronavirus research prior to the pandemic. There weren't that many of them. And now, we've had lots of scientists pivot to kind of focus on that area, in part because funding has been available. It's been available very quickly, and it needed to be, right? And that's the other thing, is that I don't want to say that, Bronson, to your point, that a diversion toward a particular area is always nefarious. I mean, that we have the NIH focusing on issues of equity, and the NSF for that matter. I mean, some of that's about Hannah Valentine, who is a researcher who I've worked with, was at Stanford, right? So some of that is about, again, the administration, right? So we read, some of you may recall that we read And the Band Played On for this book club, where Anthony Fauci, as a younger scientist, is highly portrayed in that book, and not in a positive light. So it's interesting to think about how these things have changed over time. So Pat and Dale, you've got the last question or word here before we wrap up for the evening.
My question is for Dr. Tucker Edmonds. When you look at the amount of time a physician has to prep for a meeting with a patient and diagnose that patient, right? And some of that time is limited by the fact that they have so many patients to meet, and they don't meet that many patients. They can't fund the 10 other people in the office that supports them. The protocols or shortcuts that they take, right? That's just almost the nature of the situation that the physician is put into. And yeah, it's sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong, but it just kind of is the nature of the work environment they have.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely. I mean, you're speaking to structures and the ways that structures, or the systems structure inequity. And I think that's actually absolutely true, and actually the point of concern. I'm not saying that I study shared decision making as a mechanism to try to mitigate health inequity by actually centering the patients instead of operating based on what's sort of convenient for our structures. But we still have to get the work done. And so, how do we create shared agendas? How do we, sort of ask before we start? There are actually, I would contend, and in the work that I do, I think there are actually ways to start with what the patient knows, start with what the patient needs and wants, that could actually shorten the amount of time that we spend talking about things that they don't care about or that they know already. And so there's actually an opportunity to center the patient in the encounter, even though it is short and time constrained, and to be more efficient and effective with regards to what it is. We always have our stuff that we got to get done. We got our checklist. But oftentimes I don't know if you're a provider, if you're a physician or not, but every physician has had their hand on the doorknob, and then the patient's like, oh yeah, but about, and then they come with the thing that we should have been talking about for the last 20 minutes. And it's like, we could have started there if you'd have just started with what was their primary concern, right? But you know, so I think that there are opportunities that we can both build more patient-centered approaches and build efficiencies. I really believe that, and that's sort of the nature of some of the work that I do, you know, with my health services hat on. I know we were talking about equity tonight, but in my mind, they're both, it's both and they really do connect. So I know we're
that's a really good point, Bronson. And I think that that is one of the things that this book club in particular is interested in, right? Is the idea of honoring opportunities for folks in the community to be a part of those conversations, right? To sort of see community members as having an expertise to bring to the table in terms of where these conversations go and to what end. And so I really appreciate you talking about that aspect of your work. And thank you, Pat, for the question, because I think it is an important part of this broader conversation about equity and about inclusion. So thank you all. I want to, if you would join me in thanking our expert guest tonight, Dr. Bronson Tucker Edmonds, for leading our conversation tonight about Superior. I think it was a great, I know it's a little bit of a departure from some of the maybe more life sciences books that we've read in the past, but I hope that you enjoyed it and that you had an opportunity to maybe think differently about some of the history of science and how that all plays together. So just a reminder that we will be together again on the last Tuesday of May. And so please join us for our May conversation, and then we take a break for the summer and come back in the fall. You can check the Indiana Humanities website, which has more information about our book for May, and our expert guest is Dr. Andy Gavrin from the IUPUI Department of Physics, so we'll be happy to have him. And just a reminder, if you've not yet had a chance to check out that link that I mentioned earlier for the conversation that we will be having around nature and the natural world of the Indiana Sciences and the City Nature Challenge over this upcoming weekend. So thank you again, Dr. Tucker Edmonds. We really appreciate this. This was a lot of fun. And I hope that you all enjoyed getting the chance to interact. Please join us again last Tuesday of May. Thank you all for your continued engagement in this project. There are a couple of links for you in the chat. And with that, we'll sign off for the evening. Take care, everybody. Be safe.
Thanks, guys.